Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's that time again for you to turn off your cell phones, wear your name tag, and of course sign in, please. By the way, we will have a new policy for name tags, not name tags, for your cell phones. If your cell phone rings during class, you will have to sit in the corner and we will throw spitballs at you. So please turn your cell phones off. Okay. Tomorrow's Wisdom Wednesday, you probably all know this by now, is canceled. Near and dear to my heart, trivia time next Monday, November 6th at 11:45 to 12:45 p.m. at the Fellowship Hall, ACOC. Don't forget the holiday social, going to be a lot of fun. I know I just sent my check in, so we're good to go on that one. Well, you know those Greeks, they're a really interesting bunch, I think. They've got very interesting groups of people, and I think that some of the most interesting were the sophists. The sophists are kind of like, how do I put this? They're guys that are paid to teach you how to argue. I think that's kind of an interesting concept, and I think it's morphed today into perhaps Fox News and MSNBC. So, with that said, I give to you a man who there's never an argument about his quality teaching. Nice. Oh, and by the way, he would never give you any false history. Oh, Dr. Joseph Kicklighter.
Thank you, Frank. Outdoes himself every time. I can't believe it that after today we have just 2 more times. Goes by fast, doesn't it? In that respect, let me say that our readings cover not only the last part of this chapter, going up through 2:18, didn't we say? 2:18. But in addition to that, please go back and pick up 175, because what we're going to do next week is medieval science and philosophy, and then do classical drama at the last one. Oh, he's from St. Thomas Aquinas, don't worry. So, yeah, exactly, yes, I'm going to have the whole thing. So the very last will be November the 14th. So we are well covered regardless of the syllabus. We're going to have lots and lots to do. And for those that may be able to continue on in the winter, we'll go on with the Hellenistic period, Alexander the Great and his successors, and the early Roman Republic, leading up in the spring to my favorite, Roman Empire, and the fall of the western part of the empire and the rise of Christianity, which I think is interesting to me, and I hope it would be to you all too. So that would be the year, so to speak. But for the present, let us note the Peloponnesian War compared, some say, to World War I for Europe, which I thought was an interesting way to look at this particular period. It is an occurrence of the 5th century, and you realize, of course, that only by the end of that period are we going to be getting into what we normally think of as the great time of Greek civilization, and that is the age of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. All of that is later than this, 5th century, more in the 4th century. Therefore, we want to understand that both are highly significant, but at the same time, it's interesting for itself, this Peloponnesian War. Why Peloponnesian? Could it be because the Athenians are writing about it? So they call it the Spartan War? Yes, I suspect that has a major effect. Do we have a Spartan account? No. Everything is one-sided. Or is it? Well, our great source is, and this again is one of those textbook terms, how many of us would use this as a fill-in-the-blank, and they look at you and say, you don't really mean they had Bunsen burners and lab rats. Is it scientific history that Thucydides was doing? I don't think so. But it's one of those terms that everybody learned, so I'll repeat it too, as an idea that Thucydides, who was a down-and-out Athenian, wrote history in a way that many people, not all, but many consider to be relatively objective and void of the fun stories of Herodotus and all the rest. He claims to be, as we used to say, telling it like it is. Whether or not anybody is capable of doing that is another story, right? But in fact, as we can see here, Thucydides, who himself was a participant in the war, albeit a disgraced one, but then if we want to compare this with World War I, we went through those generals, if you remember, reading about that. Generals came and went, didn't they? French generals, British generals, and so forth. So all of this is to say that Thucydides, in fact, had a distinguished career, and then he was retired. I don't know if they had pensions back then, but he wasn't going to get one. Luckily, I guess his family had one because he retired to the estates. Exile. So he had lots of time to write. So he wrote this great work during that time, covering most of the war. Either the last was not completed, or it was lost through time. Whatever the account, he takes very conscious notice of his predecessor, Herodotus, and says, I'm not writing for, sort of as we would say today, so it makes the front tables of Barnes and Noble. But I'm writing this to leave a lasting memorial, that when people read this work, they will know how to truly understand the past. And he did not say, did not say, history repeats itself. Well, I'm okay. But just don't say that, please, or at least don't blame it on Thucydides. He merely said that we can learn from the past, and he intended to show that clearly the cause of the war was Sparta's concern over Athenian power and the growth of that power. He uses a number of what we would call devices, but given the fact that, when there are speeches and things like that, and, I used to ask students, I think, did they get an ancient tape recorder and record that? And of course we understand that this is all creative. But it's creative based on people who supposedly were there, or what we assume they would have said. And it's certainly more interesting that way. What's the role of the gods in this? None. And that makes for a duller work, because we'd love for somebody to fly in and say, let's make an Athenian fall in love with a Spartan, and then, yeah, I mean, I can do some creative, yeah. But it just doesn't happen that way. It's all about reality. And the report card on human beings is not good. Okay? We're talking D here, folks. We're talking really, very few people look good, neither Athenians nor Spartans. So, that's the tale on him and his account. And let's see what else he had to say. I apologize in advance for my number of quotations. It's just I lack self-control. And some of these are really good ones. The absence of romance. Oh, yes. So there's not going to be any of Eros in this. Detract somewhat from its interest. But if it be judged useful by those inquirers who desire an exact knowledge of the past, oh, how we love that, an exact knowledge of the past as an aid to the interpretation of the future, which in the course of human things must resemble, if it does not reflect it, I shall be content. In fine, I have written my work not as an essay to win the applause of the moment, Herodotus, loser, but as a possession for all time. Yeah. So, people don't realize Thucydides had quite the ego, didn't he? He wants to make sure that people note. You might have enjoyed those cute stories about Thermopylae and all that, but that's not really history. He's just telling tales. Now, this is the real thing. So, they had the GHA, the Greek Historical Association, you know, he would have been getting some sort of honor for historical realism. And this is his version. But of course, it is of necessity from the Athenian perspective, even as some pretty ugly things are said about the Athenians, most of which I would assume is true. Now, let's begin by understanding that simply because the Persian Wars ended, the reality of the Persian Empire did not. However, the future, as far as Persians were concerned, had much to do with Athens. And why? Well, let me just give you a 5-letter word with 2 syllables starting with H. Helot. That's right. If you are a bunch of Spartans and you think, well, let's get up a group of peacekeepers who want to work on the Persian issue, and then you say, oops, maybe we better not do that. There's such a thing as overcommitment. And while we're away, the helots might come out. So we need to stay home. They are, in fact, Sparta, primarily an agricultural people who had essentially wedded themselves to their system. So the idea that they could be off on, what would we call it, foreign policy adventures, seems unlikely unless, as Thucydides will contend, they're forced to. Athens, not so much. Athens is already committed to a kind of supra-state policy. So, she sets up what will come to be called, but was not known then, the Delian League. You will not find the term anywhere in that day and age. It is a term that the textbooks created, and so we've used it ever since, and there's no reason not to. It means, in effect, that a group of naval states, I think that would be, as we like to say, a prerequisite for membership, that you would have to have a navy of some sort. Now, you may be B team, junior varsity. That doesn't matter because obviously this is like Athens is obviously going to have the greatest Navy. But when we created the Delian League Navy, everyone contributes. And I don't want to stretch this comparison too much, but you know how when you read about the Korean War, and they always speak about the UN Army and the UN Navy, and they go, I believe some of that was American, wasn't it? And yes, so obviously the Athenian percentage of naval and other military forces was overwhelmingly Athenian, not of any others. The others contributed, but that might mean one ship. So it's not like the Delian League, like everybody makes an equal contribution because they couldn't. I mean, obviously, Athens had the resources, and Athens wanted to play the big deal, and they got to. They got that great chance, but that means you got to pay out. And guess who liked that? Well, it's a democracy, and the lower classes just loved it. Because the more ships we have, the more folks like us are going to get jobs. And so Athens is growing as an imperial power, and ironically, in part propelled by democracy, partially because it seems to be good for the economy, the Athenian economy. Yeah, I mean, because so many people can go and work for the military. You may not, qualify to have positions in the service, but you can be the ones, this is me on the galley, right? Yeah, not too believable, but that's the idea. Doesn't sound like fun, but shoot, it gives you a wage. And so these kinds of projects are popular in the assembly, projects about naval building, and we'll see that as we get into the Peloponnesian War. Another point to bear in mind is that the equality here isn't going to last. The idea, you're a member, I'm a member, and we're all in this together. Well, you all remember from George Orwell, some are equal, but some are more equal than others. And I think this is clearly a case that Athens was very equal. And as will happen, he'll say, well, the Athenians will declare the crisis is so great that we can't afford to have the headquarters in the island of Delos anymore. It's just too insecure. So we'll move the treasury and so forth to Athens. Be a lot more secure there. This is a sign that what we call the Delian League will become the Athenian Empire. And when a member, I think it was the island of Naxos, I think it tried to turn in a letter of resignation. And it hurts when you lose your members. And you think, maybe if we bombed them, maybe they would change their mind. So that isn't true. Isn't that rude? But they did. The Athenians got very irritated. I guess, your feelings are hurt. And so you just show them, I don't think that'd be a good idea. Now, you're going to enjoy this. Say yes. So they will remain, and you say, well, then it's not really a league of equals. No, that was then, and this is now. So you do what we say. What had been then an association of states will now become an empire. And one senses that some of these governments may not have been up to Athenian snuff, because all of them were not democracies necessarily. Throw in a good tyranny or two. But at least those darn elites weren't running it. And we'll see that's going to be a very, very important consideration of who's on whose side. Because, I mean, how many democracies are there out there? Not a whole lot. But at least you've got to have the potential for democracy if Athens is going to acquire you or associate with you. Don't forget that. And we also remember that if you're going to be a friend of Sparta, at least you need to be an aristocracy or an oligarchy. So if you come in and start talking about tyrants, we're not interested in your kind because you're getting a little too left-wing for us. And so we'll have nothing to do with you. So that is the point. They're supposed to be working together to prevent a future Persian attack. But in the event, they are essentially helping to establish a wonderful setup for Athens' own benefit. When do you cross the line? Gradually, just like most things in history. It doesn't happen just immediately, but clearly it's getting that way, and it's getting more and more obvious because of Athenian authority. You can see by the colors that there were problems. Those that are in the red color are in fact areas that express some unhappiness about being in Athenian domination, and so they had to be put down and encouraged to change and to get with the program. And we don't accept resignations. That's very important to understand. Once you're in, there are no contract ends. Okay, you're here. You are for us. And then you can see other states. Now you notice the rest of Greece is white as snow, as they say, right? And it's clearly we can see the kinds of states that would have been on this particular side. Now, this formation, which will be eventually headquartered in Athens, is really not the Delian League anymore. The headquarters are not on the island, and clearly it is not a voluntary association. But again, it doesn't mean that all are under direct control of Athens. It simply means that Athens is totally dominating, and insofar as this matter is concerned, we follow the lead that Athens has. And that's what Thucydides meant when he was speaking of the growth of Athenian power. Because we know that once it starts, you can't just turn it off and say, we've had enough now. It's great, we love our empire, we're glad to have you all, but we don't want any more. Insatiable comes to mind. That idea of domination and authority. Not that we want Spartans, yuck. It's not that, but we want them to understand that in this world, and of course this is the important world, the rest of it is barbaric. In this world, we are number one, and don't you forget it. So you have your league, and then you have your Athenian empire, so-called. And we understand over and over again that Athens does not attack Sparta. It's not a question of Woodrow Wilson going to Congress and speaking of making the world safe for democracy. He's not, or they are not, these Athenians go in and say, we're going to make the Spartans free the Helots and create a better world for Spartans everywhere. There's none of that. It's simply a question of power. And so if we consider the Spartans the initiators, it's because they were afraid. And they were afraid because of those various questions that I've already suggested. Questions about how can we keep Helots suppressed if you all continue with all your democratic talk. And maybe some of it will get into Peloponnesus. Infections can occur, you know, we don't know. Once it gets here and all of this, how do we keep it right? We've got to put Athens down. It's a danger to us and our way of life. One theory. The war is really a series of wars that, for convenience, we call collectively the Peloponnesian War. You see the sides in the bright colors, and of course you will notice that beautiful blue. Those are the neutrals, and you'll see there are quite a few of them too. This is not to be thought of then as being, as in all Greek encounters, a war in which everybody is involved. Many decide, I guess the Swedens and Switzerlands of that day, decide that we'll just see how things go. And we wish everybody all the best. And how would you like to trade? Oh, yes. Trade is always a nice neutral thing to do. So I'm sure there's plenty of that going on, suppliers. And then, of course, there are those, and I'm afraid they're even in Greece, Persian lovers. And you think, why would a nice person like you love a barbarian like that? And I think it has much to do with the fact that the Persians had demonstrated they had a lot of clout in that world, and their record of the past indicated they might come back for another visit. We don't know. And if we do, we'll be ready for them. We'll hold out the flag of, if not friendship, at least we're willing to collaborate. And I chose that word advisedly, but there's a sense that there are people like that. And we'll see some examples later on. But look at all the Athenian allies. And I do mean ally, I didn't say friend, and I do want to make sure that is clear that these people don't necessarily love Athens, but they fear Athens, or they somehow think they're going to gain from their association. And most importantly, they don't have a choice. I mean, Athens doesn't say yes, no, maybe, you know, like the kid next door in the school. It's not like that. It's like, we are close, aren't we? And you say yes or else. So it's divided that way. Now again, look at the Peloponnesian area and all the red, and does that mean that everybody favors Spartan ideals? No, it simply means that they too have bad feelings about Athens, and Sparta's important. Nobody wants to ape Sparta, okay, that I've ever heard of. Can we be a little Sparta or grow up to be a big Sparta someday? No. I think Sparta is pretty unique, so my feeling is that all of these are simply allies and are treated as such. You can see that these wars occur in many different areas, which is interesting when you think about how far west it goes. And they often involve Persians. What would you call Persian intelligence is always out there and thinking, how can we help one side or the other in order to create more trouble for them? And because they offer the filth of lucre, who's going to turn them down? People are going to say, hey, Spartans, you need some money. You're running short. And you think, would you really fall for that? Yes, you would. You're not going to say, get away, you dirty Persians. We know what you are. It's not that at all. It's going to be, in effect, very, very tempting for the two sides, and often they will not resist. But as we will see, these various campaigns are certainly not limited to Sparta and Athens. It is, for a man like Thucydides, a vast war of worlds. And whether or not one side is good and one side is evil is for Thucydides a moot point, because he is not in that sense a moralist, and he sees some pretty bad things on both sides. Pericles was, of course, the great hero of Athens and has been honored that way ever since. For those, and I may have mentioned this before, but if I did not, his blood was as blue as it could get. His grandfather was none other than Cleisthenes through his mother, the father of democracy. But not only does he come from a line of democratic, oriented people, but he's also highly educated, military experience. He's got the rap sheet, got the whole compliments, everybody loves him, and of course, he's a born leader. He was one of those that they call generals. I say call them because that was their title, but it's more than our term general suggests. Because there were 10 of them, and they served terms, and they were elected by the citizens. Through that position, Pericles became a major power. And to me, in many ways, he supported this Athenian empire and helped stir up the process that would lead to war between Athens and Sparta. In any event, he actually died in the early stages of the war. And what did he die of? Not battle wounds, the plague. Thanks to Thucydides, this episode of the plague is better known than most, because in a very gruesome section of Thucydides, he will describe in detail the symptoms of the people who have the disease and the treatment of them. And those who are interested in the Black Death will be amazed if you compare them and you see some of the same descriptions given of people's attitudes, staying away from the people. How many people may have died? Well, when I read a third of the people, I thought, that just seems impossible. Not that I don't think that many people could die, but how would you know? I don't know in terms of record keeping. Have you ever thought about that? You know, can you go to the obituaries? You know, you think about all of the sources that we have now, and folks are just dying in Athens. And it's got to be a heavy loss of life, in part because, you remember I told you about Attica and all the folks, country folks, who lived out there and worked in the agricultural field. You know, most of those people had moved into town. And you know why? Because they were scared to death of the Spartans. They wanted to get under the security of Athens, because by this point, the Athenians were building walls to be safer. And so, human congestion has never known to help plague potential, right? It's definitely part of it. So, we do know that this population was suffering badly. This heroic image, which I suspect comes from the 17th century, actually, somewhat romantically, provides us with the setting for Pericles' speech. And it was not that long before he died himself of plague. So it's kind of interesting, because it has been compared to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, except it's about 10 times longer. Because, as everybody knows, Lincoln just said it and finished up right fast. But when you read Pericles' address in Thucydides, it doesn't seem that long, but it is one which gives, I mean, truly an idea of Athenian democracy and what the dead had fallen for, what they, that is to say, who were soldiers on behalf of Athens, and the cause they believed in, democracy and so forth, and presumably was very celebrated. It was enough that if it was really delivered that way, or if it's Thucydides' version, we don't really know. But the idea is that he had a lot of clout, and that presumably the families of the dead from the war, I'm not thinking of plague victims, that's a whole other story, would have celebrated and appreciated it. And again, it's everything I would think that a family in that kind of situation, at least who had any bit of patriotism, would have found to be very moving, that we had democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority but of the whole people. Everyone is equal before the law. What counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which the man possesses. And you think, oh, that's just really wonderful. Again, this is the kind of thing that, not to be cynical, but that at a difficult time when these losses occur, maybe you just need to have reinforced. And this is the thing that Thucydides would have stated. To go on, so I just can't get enough, is of course the whole earth is the tomb of heroic men, and their story is not given only on stone over their clay, but abides everywhere without visible symbol woven into the stuff of other men's lives. Well, again, statements like this are glorious, and presumably, and then of course he will give advice. He will say, to the women out there, I say, remarry, and if you're still of the age to have more little warriors, do. If you're their parents, just think about how nice they were and how much you enjoyed having them while they were living. In other words, he's got some different advice for the individuals in different situations. But all in all, of course, Pericles tells them they should just be thankful for being Athenian, as these great fallen heroes were. And if he gave it, or he gave something like it in Thucydides' version. It has certainly remained famous through the centuries. Now, this painting is pretty gruesome. It, I believe, is found in London, of all places, at the National Gallery. So if you're headed there anytime, check it out. The painting itself, which I think, what do you think, 19th century, Donna, maybe? It's, okay. I didn't think it was 17th. I thought the other one was. But this is probably 19th century art, but it has the elements, as you can see. I mean, it could be 14th century Florence, for goodness sakes, except for perhaps the apparel. I don't know about that. But it definitely is supposed to be a city at the time of plague. So you think Athens is fighting Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, and a third of the people are dying of plague. Is this really a good time to have a war? And you say, probably not. I think I would have chosen another time. Can we call this off? Don't you all have something to do with your helots? And maybe we can just fight another time. But more or less, they are dealing with this. And I guess the plague in this case seems to have just worn itself out, which sounds strange. I mean, a third died, but those survivors perhaps had developed some sort of immunity which allowed them to live on. Whatever it was, I don't think, just to get specific with you, I don't think it had anything to do with improvements in hygiene or anything of the sort. It just probably had to do with the passage of time. In any event, it took lots of folks, but the war went on. Now, what I love is the way he describes it, and he says, this I can the better do as I had the disease myself. So he recovered from the plague, which I just think is fascinating. You never think about that, do you? That folks get over it. We always think about people dying. But in the case, at least I know, and this may have been true of other examples of plague, in the bubonic plague in the 14th century, many people could get over it depending on conditions. And in this case, he observed it from the point of view of not only being an Athenian, but as being someone who actually recovered from it, which seems almost miraculous. All speculation as to its origin and its causes, if causes can be found adequate to produce so great a disturbance, I leave to other writers, whether lay or professional. For myself, oh, thank you, Hippocrates. Yes, you can think we're getting into the rational, because we're not calling on any gods. They didn't put some curse on us because we had sinned or something. No, no, no. I shall simply set down its nature and explain the symptoms by which perhaps it may be recognized by the student if it should ever break out again. But while the nature of the distemper was such as to baffle all description and its attacks almost too grievous for human nature to endure, it was still in the following circumstances that its difference from all ordinary disorders were most clearly shown. And this is fascinating. All the birds and beasts that prey upon human beings either abstained or died after touching them. That's a nice thought, isn't it? Let me So, yes. So, we're going to move on shortly, don't worry. I just thought I would do a little plague talk here and make you realize that that's part and parcel of the atmosphere of Athens during the Peloponnesian War. And I wonder, you're trying to get people peppy, and you're trying to say, you know, we're excited about defeating Sparta and so forth, but it is absolutely amazing to me, particularly with the death of Pericles, that people will resume this awful conflict with the Spartans. And remember, the Spartans are in and out because at one point during the Peloponnesian War, that whole area will experience a violent earthquake. And you might say, well, that is just awful. I guess people are really saying, not the Helots. The Helots are pretty darn excited because they say, I think it's time for an insurrection. Yeah, all those Spartans just dead. We can take over now. So, in fact, then, we understand there was trouble on both sides. Don't worry about that. Yes, we have used artistic history when we have it, and that this was found by archaeologists really fascinates me. We think, and we'll get to it, I think, in 2 weeks, the play Lysistrata that I know many of you know by Aristophanes, excuse me. But we know that there were serious expressions of family love and devotion to duty and all the rest of it that's part of our human situation, and it was equally part of theirs. And again, as I say, all of this is going on simultaneously. The plague, the war, the truces, the earthquake. It's quite a busy schedule during this latter half of the 5th century and the changes that will be coming about. Now again, the hoplites are much in evidence during this period. And remember that these hoplites are not merely the foot soldiers, but they are, in a sense, the professional fighters that were so important to the land force of the Athenians. Not so much an example of democracy, because the hoplites have been around much longer than that, and this would have been a major career. Though not the only one in Athens, as it would have been in Sparta, remember that. In other words, these Athenians may have had another life altogether, but this is what was going on at that particular time. Now, let's look, if we can, at the island of Melos. Most of us know it from Venus de Milo. I don't really know if anybody lives there now. Maybe one of those islands that is not inhabited. But during the war, this island had a city-state which had been colonized by Spartans. In other words, these people are what we would call kissing cousins of the Spartans. Not necessarily their same society, but their same ethnicity. And one of the most interesting, at least to me, situations that will occur in Thucydides' account has to do with what is called the Melian dialogue. It's more like a monologue to me, but the Melian dialogue essentially tells us what Athenian leaders say to the leaders of Melos. They must have arrived in their ships, and they'd already sent word to the leaders of Melos, we want you on our side. And don't you love to be sort of urged and encouraged? We'd love to have you join us. You know, we've all done that, go out and reach out to people and say, please be part of us. But, unfortunately, I don't think Athens wanted to use those kinds of positive messages. And you think, why do they have to be so hateful? Well, let's ask the Athenians to explain for themselves. Now remember, this is from Thucydides. who was Athenian himself. And why do they do this? We shall not trouble you with specious pretenses. I love that phrase, specious pretenses. So we're not going to say something like, gosh, we'll be a stronger team by having you. You know, that sounds nice, but who would believe it, right? I mean, you're surrounded by Athenian war types, and these media leaders say, so you really care about us. That's beautiful, yeah. So we don't believe that, so that's specious. Okay, either of how we have a right to our empire because we overthrew the Persians, or are now attacking you because of the wrong you have done us. And what wrong did you do us? You just existed as a friend of Sparta, and that annoys us. And so they're not even in the war. They're neutrals. But that annoys us. Because we like everybody to be our friend. Will you be our friend? You know, that kind of thing. And then say, can't we just love everybody? How about that? Will that work? No, that won't work at all. Because it annoys us that you are neutral. And so, what are they going to say? They're going to say, in effect, that you're not an equal, we're big, you're a runt, and so you better surrender. And the Melians did not, and so the Athenians kill all the men and sell the women and children into slavery. That's not very nice. So think about that during your 5-minute break. 5 minutes. The Melian dialogue basically, have I got this on right? Is this, okay. The Melian dialogue, I think, is in there in Thucydides' major work because he wants us to see, what would you call it, a kind of military Darwinism, a kind of you're little and we're big, and so don't talk to us as if, you know, this is some kind of Panhellenic session. We're all good Greeks and therefore give me a hug. No. You're little and losers, and we're big and winners. And so if we had any sympathy for the Athenians, we certainly can't lose it in this particular situation. But if we want to switch over and say, well, then we want to love the Spartans. Oh, we do? Maybe you could talk to some Helots and ask them how lovable they are, okay? So there isn't anyone really to love here. And that's why sometimes reading Thucydides is not one that uplifts you and makes you happy about humanity. Even then, with this historical analysis, think about it, all those centuries, we can recognize the idea of people at war and how they act and what kinds of policies they carry out. Corfu is an island off the coast of Greece that some of you are familiar with. I happen to be familiar with it because of World War I, but because it was a major international hotspot after the war. Never mind that. The description of its internal struggle is what I wanted to share with you today. And that has to do with the fact that there are two parties, two groups, factions, trying to run this city. And as you see, Corcyra, Corfu. And on this island, which is south of Athens, I do believe, it was, in fact, split between the pro-Spartans and pro-Athenians. They had different groups. And that would mean the pro-democrats or the pro-oligarchs. These are the ruling classes now. And what do the masses have to do with it? Well, they come in whenever we need them. You know, it's like they're used. So when there's some struggle, they say, would you like to be on our side? You know, we've got a free dinner or something like that. So what does he have to say? Words change their ordinary meaning, and reckless audacity came to be considered the courage of a loyal supporter. Prudent hesitation was now known as specious cowardice. Yeah. Moderation was held to be a cloak for unmanliness. Ability to see all sides of a question, incapacity to act on any. Yeah. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness. Cautious plotting, a justifiable means of self-defense. The advocate of extreme measures was always trustworthy. His opponent, a man to be suspected. To succeed in a plot was to have a shrewd head. To divine a plot, still shrewder. But to try to provide against having to do either was to break up your party and be afraid of your adversaries. In other words, when you are in a city with these kinds of problems, watch your step. And you know that can sometimes be true if you start to think about wartime in our own country or in others. How people act and how leaders split up and all of the things. Quite often it does not bring out the best in people. And as they are struggling for control, these are the kinds of observations that he makes. Now, is this scientific history? Well, I don't know. I don't think so. But it certainly has the ring of truth to it, in the sense of merely observing how people act. Because this is going on in manifold places, not merely this particular place. Think of all those city-states and all the places that were not necessarily bound to either Sparta or Athens. But don't you consider the elements that supported them were trying to egg this process on? That's his point. And the point being that people do not want to have a rational approach. They do not want to think of this in a free and open-minded way. That's not the way people are in war. And so I always beg people never to confuse this with just a struggle between righteous and holy Democrats versus these nasty old Spartans. Because I think it's so much more complex than that. And I think Thucydides would definitely agree, he, the great and aristocratic Athenian, who is now on his estate, riding away and enjoying the good life. Now, the Sicilian expedition. Many of us have been to Sicily. I love Sicily, so interesting and beautiful and very historic. And I don't mean just The Godfather. None of that. No disparaging remarks. But Sicily had a great attraction for this Greek ancient world. There were lots of Greek colonies in Sicily. You know the number of influences, if you visit Sicily, the number of non-Italian influences there in Sicily, just amazing, including German. Let's never forget emperor. German emperor was, in fact, ruler of Sicily. So all in all, Sicily was an important place, not least of because of its economic value. Lots of grain, lots of grain. It was a major food supply. So, we're all interested in Sicily, but more especially, we are interested in controlling that area if we are Athens, because Syracuse, the major city at that time, would have had Spartan associations. And the Athenians don't like that. So they are up for making this major campaign. And you know assemblies, that democratic assembly, and everybody wants to have your say, and some of the more aristocratic, fiscal conservative types may say, now folks, let's calm down with this. Let's not get overwrought. That's a lot of expense. But it was said that those who led the people were saying, this will be great. It's a wonderful opportunity for Athens and for you and your families. Yes. Those demagogues, those silver-tongued devils, they can really get us excited. Sign up here, you know. And that is the idea, that in the assembly, despite the cautions of some of the conservative upper class, the decision was made that we will send the Athenian Navy and our allies on a campaign in Sicily. Well, what could possibly be wrong with that? Well, there was more to it than that. It would be led by a man named Alcibiades. Alcibiades, as the painting will show you, why, yes, he had a love of philosophy. And you see him there being dragged by Socrates. He was a student of Socrates, yeah, Philosophy 101. He took the survey, took the advanced classes. He worked very, very hard, and you'd say, well, with all of his philosophical learning, then why is Socrates dragging him away? He had other hobbies. As the prayer book used to put it, the world, the flesh, and the devil. And this, in effect, was a problem for a student of philosophy. Because philosophers need to eschew these kinds of pastimes. But Alcibiades was a very busy guy, a shrewd politician. He was from one of the leading families. Socrates would have had it no other way. Socrates didn't teach regular folks. I mean, you had to have your credentials. More on Socrates later. But I just thought this would allow us to consider what it was that Alcibiades was up to. He was a major political figure, young, in this period, and he was chosen as one of the leaders of the Athenian force in the Sicilian expedition. Well, after he got out of town, how would we say it now? There were indictments against him. That he had invaded some sort of women's only religious right. And that's a no-no. So what do we do? Well, it's a big B, blasphemy. And they were prepared to get him and bring him back. He was about halfway there with the Athenian fleet. This is all told to us by other sources. So poor Alcibiades makes a jump for it. He says, you know, this has been real. I want to wish everybody a lot of luck on the trip. Go Athens, down with Sparta. And he gets to Sparta. He's a turncoat. He says, are you looking for some good military advice? Because I'm the one to give it. You know, I'm Athenian. I love Athens in a way. But they went wrong, and now, so like that old television show, Have Gun Will Travel. I mean, it's like he was now ready to help the military efforts of the Spartans. And the Spartans are thrilled, you can imagine. People love turncoats, or as we used to say, quislings. This is just a dream. Alcibiades, come on in, welcome to Sparta. We have a lovely place for you, and we want to talk to you, and we just appreciate your advice. And one mistake, he makes a bad boo-boo. He gives them lots of good advice about Athenian military techniques, but he makes one mistake. He meets the Spartan queen, and yes, the way of all flesh. So that is such a pitfall. If he could have just said, how could something so right be so wrong? And yet, whatever, I know. But you just don't go to another foreign country and seduce the queen. That's rude. Very, very bad manner. So, Alcibiades is going to be moving on. And he will end up, believe it or not, in Persia. Well, they offered a really nice package. A lot of extra benefits and so forth. The guy had an enormous skill of coming back. But in fact, a funny thing happened on the way to Sicily, right? It's amazing how he ended up after a personal life that was definitely not Socratic in nature. But he was part of the Socrates school. Not everybody can be a Plato, let's face it. So we all have students of whom we can't always be proud. We like to thank all of our students. Yeah, we like to think, I know, Carol, we like to think of our students as all being gifted and highly successful. We're living a lie, Carol. It's just, we've got to accept there's a rotten apple in there. And that's Alcibiades as far as Socrates is concerned. Ultimately, Sparta will prevail. And the reasons I think that it does prevail have to do with the fact of what we would call a war of attrition. The Spartans will, with their allies, of course, with a great land force, be able to so impound the Attican area that even with a third of the people killed in the Black Death, that population will succumb to all, well, you've read stories, we all have, about people in a city eventually succumbing to a siege. I guess part of it's psychological and part of it is simply the reality of we can't win this one. Whatever it was, the people who, successors, of course, of Pericles, decide they are no longer ready to go on. Would the Persians have been willing to help them? Well, I guess we will never know. But what we do know is that the Persians were probably a little down because it was over. But on the other hand, they had a situation that they could enjoy back home and think, God, what losers. Those stupid Greeks. They just had to kill each other and hurt each other, and then we come out still dominant. Now, what happened, as you can see, is that ultimately that the Athenian walls, these so-called long walls, had helped the Athenians preserve their city, but you know, eventually, without supplies and all the rest, life is going to get very, very rough. And so, it is not surprising then that the Spartans, and you know the Spartans must have been getting anxious to get on back home. Not because they missed their wives, no, but because of Helots. I mean, you can't be away long, because there's always that terrible issue waiting for them to deal with. So, in fact then, we know the Athenians surrendered, and the Spartans gave them what I would call, under the circumstances, pretty nice terms. Because in many cases, when one considers what the Athenians did to various people, the Spartans could well have said, okay, men are dead, and women and children are slaves. So, that's not what they did at all. Athens was allowed, thank goodness, to continue on as a city. But it will no longer be what it had been in the past. Why? Well, because it is stripped of its empire. And no one says, could we or would we be allowed to maintain some of our colonies? Well, the answer is no. I mean, it's not like this is, what did they used to call it in the 60s? Non-negotiable demand. Well, this was very non-negotiable, if I may use very, because I don't think it's not up for discussion. Because now we are going to make you weak. We have exhausted a lot of resources, including Spartan men, on you. And we resent that. And so now, you are going to be made harmless. And that refers, of course, only to their military might. I thought almost to, Germany in 1918, 1919 in terms of no more Air Force or limited Navy and all the rest of it. Very, very small military. And that mainly, as they'll argue, for economic purposes. You can have some ships, but we've got to see them working in international trade. We don't want them to be troublesome. Now, we made all our demands, and this democracy's got to go too, because that got you into trouble before. If it hadn't been for all those folks telling you to go to Sicily or go here or there or the other, you could have behaved and not gotten in the trouble you're in, and now look at you. Oh, and it was nasty. The Thucydides piece will tell us all about what the Spartans and their allies did with the captured Greeks. And it would be basically a question of putting most of them in some great pit where they were just kept and some food thrown at them occasionally until they rotted. Well, yeah, I mean, it's not pretty, but war isn't either, is it? So all of this is in effect letting us know that once the Spartans won, they tried but failed to eliminate democracy. Eventually they gave up on that. And you know why they gave up? Because they had to get home. It's not we can have the care and feeding of Athens being a 24/7 project. We need to get this set up and then leave, hoping that they have learned the appropriate lessons from their experience. And of course, I'm sure there were some Athenian quislings, if you will, in Athens who would say, we are part of the new regime, we love Sparta, you're good people, and we want to, you know, and all of that. I don't think they had a lot of strength, because in a few years, a democracy of sorts will be restored in Athens. One senses then no major changes within Athens except, look, Mom, no more empire. Now that is very clear. And I might add, for history, it's the end of an Athenian empire. There's not going to be one in the future, anything of the sort. It's just, it was nice while it lasted. And that was great, and that was during Thucydides' time, and it is no more. So you see, it didn't last long. Could it have lasted longer? Well, I guess if the Spartans had been willing to stay around and enforce it, if the Spartans had been willing, I guess, to maintain some kind of police state in Athens. But again, I don't think they had either the resources or the desire. Sparta's all about Sparta, right? So they were out, and this board of tyrants, supporters of tyranny, probably did not have a lot of people supporting them. So, back to democracy in the aftermath. And we are at the end of the 5th century, which is important, because there will be no empire. And as far as Greece itself, we begin to speak of a Spartan hegemony. I love that word. It's a good Greek derivative having to do with the domination. And you say, oh, wow, the Spartans are dominant. They have hegemony. Well, they do, but they don't, because they don't really want it. If you're Spartan, it's not like you, yeah, we've secretly lusted for power over all the Greeks. This is, we're so Hellenic. No, we're not. We're Spartans. You know that term, parochial? I like it right here. I remember passing the billboard one time. It was in Lee County between our fair Auburn and our dear neighbor, Opelika. It was a big billboard, and it said, "We got it good in Opelika." And I thought, could there be anything more parochial? I said, let's go out and explore Lynette, or other lovely cities in our area. Why must we be limited to Opelika, as fine as it is, right? So, in that sense, you can understand why would the Spartans, who think they live in, I guess, the pagan version of the Garden of Eden, they are so interested. Well, the only reason they would be interested is their fears of other people, including Greeks. And, of course, of their own serfs, meaning Helots. Strange situation that Sparta is going to have this dominant position, but very reluctantly so. And many say it will lead to her downfall because she lacks the resources. Do you know the population went way, way down? And we think that's probably because there are so many men are casualties in war. We are talking about the ruling class, too. The Spartans. Oh, our Helots are fine. We're just as fertile as can be. So thank you very much. So I guess working is good for reproduction. But I mean, you know, think if you were an insurance producer and one of these Spartan guys came in and said, I want to get a policy for the family. And they said, I don't think so. You're already 35? Woo. Your good years are past, man. You know, yeah, I mean, it's not easy being a warrior and living. So, in fact, then, we sense that this was going to be a difficult and, in the end, a downward period for Sparta. Not so much for Athens, though, as we know. However, it will be an end for the idea of Greek independence because of this man, played by Val Kilmer in the movie about 20 years ago, not such a good movie, but a movie nonetheless, Philip of Macedonia. Now, I'm introducing him only to do that because he will make a major reappearance in 2018. But for the purposes of this course, he is appearing only because the Macedonians to the north of Greece are very interested in the comings and goings down south. Macedonia is related ethnically to the Greeks, but they are in an entirely different world in a certain political way. I mean, for example, they still have a king. However, they now have in Philip a very ambitious king and a military genius who views the situation in Greece, troubled Spartans, impotent Athenians, and think, why not me? Why couldn't I rule over all of this? And so, if you think this is a sort of intro to Macedonian studies, you're absolutely right. The real winner, it seems to me, in the Peloponnesian War will not be Spartans or Athenians, at least in a military sense, but it will be the Macedonians who will come in this time and the time of Philip's son Alexander to bring all these Greeks, for once and for all, under control, as in, now y'all shut up and line up and do what you're told. Because they obviously couldn't manage that for themselves, so now we'll do it for you. And that, of course, will be part of this great 4th century. Now, we will be getting into this period, no doubt about it, because of the fact that as we enter this period, we're already in the time of Plato and Aristotle, the great writers of drama. And all of this is terribly important. Well, I've already mentioned Lysistrata, and let me mention in addition the fact that a variety of plays were written about the Persian Wars also, that these events were in a sense contemporaneous with the people who wrote about them. And it's interesting, the writers well understood, well knew how horrible war is and all of the terrible things that it brings, few of them being any good. Not that there are any final solutions any more than Thucydides could tell people of the future that beware of those who say that through war you will become successful and dominant. He apparently knew all too well, even as he died in the latter years of this particular one. Finally, just to note the map, if you had been, now this is not modern Macedonia. They always caution you not to confuse the two, because classical Macedonians were thought to have been ethnic Greeks. And as I understand it, today's Macedonia makes no such claim. But they use that particular name, which is very significant. But I just want you to keep that look, that beautiful blue color, and be aware of that as 2018 is right around the corner. And we'll have more on Macedonia then. But come back next week for science and philosophy. Okay? Thank you. Thank you.